Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Headlines and History with your host, me, Jon Molik. Now, episode 42, so it's part 2 of our Israel-Palestine big topic conversation series, I guess you can call it, because it's going to end up being a few different episodes from what I can gather now that we've shortened them up a little bit here. And so we're gonna charge right on. Last week, what we talked about was the claim that Israel has a right to exist because the Jews were there first. The Israelites, if we're going back to the Bible, were there first, and so therefore we could wash away or minimize at the very least all of the other arguments and make the claim that because they were here first, they're the ones that should have the right to the land, if you will. And we talked about the counter arguments as to that can't be the case. That's not how the world works. And it's hypocritical to think one way, say about the Native Americans in the United States, and then the Jewish people and Palestinians in the land of Palestine. So, and then we moved on to the religious aspect, where I reminded everyone that religion does play a major role in this conflict and that it's foundational in some ways. We talked about how there's a literal connection to God between God and the Jews, the Jewish people, the temple, and having God live here in the Holy of Holies, and then the connection between Muhammad and his flight to heaven. Anyways, and how you should just beware of those that make the claim that this is not a religious argument and that there's other things at play. While there may be, religion certainly plays a role. So we're gonna go on to another couple of topics. Maybe we'll cover 3. It depends on how much I ramble, and remind everybody that I do not speak for the DoD, the U.S. Army, or anybody else when we're having these conversations. In particular, this one, given how of a hot topic this is, and it's emotional, it's personal, and clearly I'm just speaking for myself, and I'm no expert, I'm no scholar. I refer to episode 41 rather for my explanation as to what I believe there, but nonetheless, people have asked the opinion, so I'll give it as best I can. So the next point, I should say, the one that's going to start off this episode is more of a question, and that is, does Israel have the right to exist? And I bring this one up because this is a claim that you hear often in the media from either side. And whether it's even the case that Israel morally, legally should even be there. Now, some of the other topics that we're going to talk about are going to give you an understanding, I hope, or help present context that will argue whether Israel has the right to exist, whether the Palestinian people who live in Gaza, for example, have a legal and moral right, an ethical duty to fight against what they perceive as an occupation, and whether that would be the case for anybody else in their plight, going through the plight that they are as they see it. But this point here is more about whether that's even a question that should exist. And what I mean by that is there's the basic assumption that Israel should or shouldn't, and therefore there's all of these arguments back and forth. Again, 2 of which I brought up last episode. But I think what I'm trying to say, the point I'm trying to make here today, is that it's not the right question. And it's not even a question if we're going to make any tangible changes. If we're going to move forward and find a resolution, then maybe that's not even the question that we should be asking. Because it does exist. And so there's room to have the argument with scholars and historians and academics and moralists and clergy, if you will, and they can have all of these high-minded conversations, and they can bring up these topics like I have before, and they can go back and forth as to whether it's even something to be discussed. But from a geopolitical standpoint, from a diplomatic standpoint, and this is where I had first heard this from a senior, and I don't recall the name right now, but a senior member of the UN who said, when asked by a member of the media, does Israel even have the right to exist, and how do you see this from the UN's perspective? I thought her answer was brilliant, and that is, it doesn't have an answer. The answer is it does exist. It does. It was created legally by the United Nations. And when I say legally, I mean from an international law perspective, where most countries at least try to abide by that international agreement. And clearly not everyone, but almost the entire world is a part of the United Nations in some way. And so when the United Nations makes some decision that is voted upon by its members, it is generally considered agreed upon by the globe. And the United Nations has recognized Israel since 1948, that it is a legal nation. It has borders. It's allowed to do what any other nation would do: defend itself, feed itself, have relationships, all of those things. And so from a geopolitical standpoint, it's not even a valuable question. It's like asking if Ireland has a right to exist and then arguing about it for centuries. Right. And this is not me minimizing the challenges that come along with the Israel and Palestine conflict. Okay. And I'll use the word conflict because that's what it is. And there are people that argue online that it's not even a conflict. It's so much more heady than that. And that there's, and in books too. I'm not just saying online, social media and things like that, but it is a conflict. Okay. That's the best way to really describe it. And again, it's in no way to minimize it by saying it's like asking if Ireland exists, but it is the case when it comes to dealing with problems that are on the face of it right now. And so when the international community is dealing with terrorists who cross a legal border as recognized by the UN on October 7th and slaughter people, you have to deal with that issue right there. And then when Iran starts using proxies, and that is the right word, the Houthis and Hezbollah and the rest, to attack Israel because it doesn't believe, again, religiously mainly, that Israel has the right to exist, quote unquote. It doesn't matter because it does. And so how do we deal with the reality that is? And so if we want to live within the academic, if we want to live within the podcast world, if we want to sit down and have discussions about the origins and all those things, it's a worthwhile venture. And clearly we're doing it here. And so there's value in understanding the depth and complexity of what's happening. But when you're dealing with the today and right now, it's not the right question because it does exist. And so we have to figure out how to deal with the problem. And if your counter argument to that is, well, the right here and right now is it does exist, but it could not exist tomorrow, again, that's not a reality-based comment. Because it would be the equivalent of saying, well, okay, fine, Ireland exists, but it might not exist tomorrow. Well, I can foresee within the future, I could not foresee, rather, is a better way to say it. I could not foresee within any future that matters, Ireland not existing, because Ireland decided or agreed that it shouldn't exist. Now, obviously, countries rise and they fall, and conflicts happen, and Russia has invaded Ukraine. So yes, Ukraine looks different. I got it, right? And I understand that nothing is permanent, and come on, that's silly. I understand all of that. But from a, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation about whether Israel should exist tomorrow, it's the same concept again as whether Ireland should exist tomorrow, or whether the United States is going to exist tomorrow, or whether Brazil is going to exist tomorrow. Yeah, the answer is yes. The answer is yes. And so how are we going to get through this? Hamas may have a different point of view, and we'll talk about that in the future. But when I say it's going to exist tomorrow, I'm talking about the real relevant players at the table. Okay, let's just be honest. You can maybe have some ideological support for Hamas in some way and a grander belief as to whether Israel should exist, and you can have this grander ideological support for fighting against corrupt leadership and all of these things. Okay, I got it. But when we're talking about the real decision makers, Israel is going to exist tomorrow. The leadership in Israel doesn't want to go anywhere. It's not going to go anywhere, nor is Ireland. So if we're going to talk about what we can do in the here and now, don't ask the question because it's not relevant. Let's leave it in the world of podcasts and academia. Now, what I will say, as it relates to this question of whether it does exist, it isn't that simple. To be fair, okay, there are nuances, again, as riddled throughout this conflict, right? That cause problems in the here and now, that relate to whether Israel has the right to exist. So again, I'll grant it isn't just that simple. One of the issues is settlers, and this partially relates back to what we had talked about last episode when it comes to religion. There are people that live in Israel proper today that are not willing to sit down at the big boy table, if you will, and hash out a secular diplomatic program or schedule or whatever process to settle the land conflicts with Israel and the Palestinians. It's easy, I think, to argue Hamas is one of those entities that is not interested in sitting down at the big boy table, or isn't going to be allowed to, let's say, based on their behavior. The supreme Ayatollah in Tehran is not going to sit down at the big boy table and have this discussion because he's not interested in being open-minded about it. And there are Israelis that are the same way. Let's be fair. There are settlers that are encroaching upon land in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, from the Israeli point of view. That's their name. And the West Bank being the internationally agreed upon title. It's not right, it's not wrong, it just is. And these settlers, who are often religious conservatives who believe that Israel needs to return to its original size and state, which is not just the land of Palestine, which is on a map, which is on most maps you'll see from the late 1800s, World War I, World War II, 20th century type stuff, where it's the land of Israel today. There is a biblical land of Israel that many believe is much larger than today's Israel proper, and it works its way into Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and further on, and that in order for the temple, the third temple, to be rebuilt, now we're talking religiously and prophetically here, this is why I'm relating it back to episode 41, that in order for the temple to be rebuilt, the Holy of Holies to be reinstalled, and then God to return to earth in the way that he's supposed to, from the Jewish perspective, is that for the entirety of Israel to be reborn. And these settlers that live within Israel proper, they continue to forcibly move themselves back into Judea and Samaria to try to step by step, stone by stone, return the land as I had just described. And so that's not helpful. It's not helpful. Now, if you go to Israel and you have a discussion with an everyday Israeli who, whether generally religious or secular, admittedly, most of the individuals that I had dealt with and met when I was there were secular. But the vast majority believe that it's just not right to be encroaching in the West Bank, and don't necessarily believe in this greater Israel and then the return of the temple and all these things. And so they should just leave it alone. Right. Now, there are others that don't, whatever, but that don't believe that, but they don't spend their time forcibly settling back into the West Bank. And so that is a group of people that in the here right now comment whether Israel has a right to exist, they meddle and they make it not as simplistic as it can be. Okay? And on the other side of that comment, when it comes to Israel having the right to exist, I'll get a bit more historical there, but it's the argument that on the Israeli side, that why do the Palestinians, why do the Arabs that live there even have any right and or desire and or claim to Israel proper today? Because they have all of this other land. Right? I often hear on the news and in certain articles, and they post these pictures of the quote unquote Arab world, and includes, almost the entirety of the Middle East, but, Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Syria and all these places where the Arab people live, and all the way down to Yemen and Egypt and other places. So they say, well, look, there's all of this land here, and Arabs, quote unquote Arabs, have the right to live, and no one cares that they live in all of these places. So why are you Arabs encroaching on Jewish land? We just want our own little sliver of property. On its face, it seems logical, it seems valid. If you contextualize, if you frame the argument rather in hey, this is a Jewish Arab issue, and I say Jewish from an ethnic standpoint, right? Because there is the reality that there is a Jewish ethnicity as well as a religion. And so if you look at it from the Jewish people and the Arab people, if you build that frame, then yes, the Arab people have more property and have more space, and then therefore don't need to be dealing with Israel. And it's, by the way, it's not even the most religious land. It's the third most. Mecca and Medina are the two locations that mean the most to Muslims. And so, okay, great. So you give up your third spot where the Jews really only have the one, and that's Jerusalem. Again, Arab versus Jew, it makes sense. But that's not how the world works. Claiming that the Arab people have enough land is like claiming that white people have enough land. Caucasians have enough land. Why should Caucasians live in Germany when, there's plenty of room for whites? I'm just, I'm using a pejorative here, but I'm doing it purposely because there's plenty of land in Russia, right? Those are like white people. Those are Caucasian. So just everybody from France and Germany should move into Russia because there's plenty of land. And so we should be giving, France and Germany to the Kurds, for example, a whole nother ethnic group, which we haven't discussed yet, but we'll get into further later. There's the largest ethnic group in the world that has no country of its own, the Kurdish people. They don't have any country, so let's give that to Germany. Let's give Germany to the Kurds. That makes sense. Whites have enough. But of course, what's going to happen? The Germans are going to step up and they're going to say, well, come on. Let's be honest about this. We can't just be labeling people white. That doesn't make any sense. And it's the same way as we can't be labeling people Arab. Right? Yeah, it's not a helpful descriptor when we're discussing these very, very nuanced and personal conversations, topics. And so if it's not fair for Caucasians, if we get to stand up and say, and Caucasian myself, if I get to stand up and say, you can't do that, Germans are not French, and the French are not Russian. Why is that obvious? But it's not obvious to outsiders from an Arab perspective. Because the Arabs that grew up in Yemen, that came from southern Arabia, are not the same Arabs that have been in Iraq for so long. And they're not the same that have, that lived in Oman for as long as they have. They're different. It's nuanced. There's different tribes. There's different variations on the language. They're different across the entire spectrum of the Middle East. And so it's, I don't say this negatively in order to, point fingers and from a position of authority in some sense, but there's an ignorance baked in when we say, but the Arabs have enough space. It just doesn't work that way. The people that live in the area of Palestine, again, calling it Palestine, are different than the people from Mecca. And so we, as non-indigenous folks from that region that have more of an understanding of our own history, we need to be honest about that and say, okay, well, if I'm able to, create these delineations within my ethnic and racial terms, then we need to allow other people to do the same thing. And then the quote, Arabs have enough land doesn't make any sense. Okay? It doesn't make any sense, like it doesn't for us. So the question as to that point I made there was a little bit more disconnected, but nonetheless, does Israel have the right to exist? When we're talking about today, it's just not the right question. Now, the other one that I'll get into is the one that is often brought up in the media today, and this has to do with, because of what happened on October 7th, is genocide. And this is a really hot topic in the social media world, even in the academic world. I've read some good articles on this. When it comes to whether Israel is committing a quote-unquote genocide in Gaza in particular. There's that's the most poignant and that's the most common claim, is that in Gaza in particular, the Israeli military is committing genocide. That's the claim. And there are others on the more extreme levels that would say the same thing about what Israel is doing in Lebanon and potentially doing even in the West Bank and then now in Syria and here and there. But really, it's all about the images that you see coming out of Gaza. And people often use the description, or it's not the description, it is the definition, again, agreed upon by the members of the United Nations, as to what a genocide is. And so you'll see people post it online often, or give this little tweet on X or something, or Blue Sky, and they'll say, here are the criteria for genocide. And look, Israel is hitting all of these marks. And so clearly they're committing genocide. Okay. So I think in order to have a smart discussion about whether Israel is or isn't, it's smart to go and describe these elements, is what you're calling it, right? Because if we're talking about laws, you have elements underneath what a particular law is. So if the law says genocide is this, in order to meet that criteria, you need to have these elements, okay? So the 5 elements, and then I'll get back to the general definition in a second, but the 5 elements, and what are really referred to as like the physical elements, the actions that need to be taken to be considered genocidal, are the following. And interesting, it only has to be one. So oftentimes in a law, you need these 3 elements in order for this law to be broken. Right? So if you commit a robbery, and I'm just making this up, I'm not saying this is an actual law, but it would work in this way. If you committed a robbery and it was robbery first, there's multiple levels of a certain crime. So robbery in the first degree, you not only need to physically assault someone, that's one element. Then you need to use a weapon to do so. That's element number 2. and you need to actually retrieve the item that you were looking to take. That's element 3. If you don't have all 3 of those elements, you didn't commit robbery first. You may have committed robbery second, which have 2 elements, maybe not 3, but you need to have the elements to come up with the actual crime. It's the same way here when it comes to the UN definition of genocide, except that there are 5 different elements that are options. What I mean by that is that you only need 1. You don't need 2 out of the 5. You don't need 3. You just need 1. So if you're doing 1, then you're committing a genocide, according to the UN. So it's number 1, killing members of a group, just killing members of a group, or causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group. They use the word the group, but so, because that indicates that there's a particular people, a particular element that someone is committing genocide against. So killing members of the group, to causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in part or in whole. Let me say that again. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in part or in whole, which is basically like starvation. That would be an example. So if you are not actively killing them, if you are not actively trying to commit mental harm in whatever way you choose, you could, number 3, you could create an environment where everyone starves and then eventually will die, or the group has to move. It's forcibly moved. So that's an element of genocide. 4, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. I'll give you whatever, come up with your own example there. I don't need to go into that. However that could be accomplished. I'm sure you can come up with many ways. Or 5, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. That's an element of genocide. So if one entity is doing any of these things, they're committing genocide against another group. All right. And those are the physical elements. The mental element, it's often called, is the ultimate definition, and that is the, quote, intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And then the physical elements come. So the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, religious, or racial group as such. So if you're to look at that definition, people do, they go, intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnical, that's good. So we have Palestinians that are ethnic, national. Some people would even claim that Gaza is its own nation in some way. Okay, and then they're all Muslims generally in Gaza. So it fits all the criteria, and then they're clearly killing them or causing bodily harm and mental harm. So it's almost like they get all of them. And so when I say they, I mean the Israelis against those in Gaza in particular. And so they say, look, it's obvious. The elements have been met. Genocide is occurring. The problem is you're not fully, those that make that claim are not fully looking into and deciphering and including the first word, and that is intent. And it's a complicated word. Why do I say that? Because technically, if the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, are clearing tunnels in Gaza, let's say underneath Shifa Hospital, where Hamas built them, just as an example, and they end up killing, intentionally killing the people that are in the tunnels, defending the tunnels, then you could say they have the intent. It's clear. They're intending to do damage to people that are in those tunnels, defending the tunnels. The problem is the definition of genocide includes the intent to do the damage to those groups or a group because it is a group or that group. That isn't the case in Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces are not interested in going into Gaza to kill Muslims because they're Muslims. That isn't the intent. They happen to be killing Muslims because the terrorists that live in Gaza, not all of them, don't put those words in my mouth, but the terrorists who happen to live in Gaza, that live there, just happen to be Muslims. They happen to be Arab. But ultimately, they're terrorists. And so the Israelis are killing them because they're terrorists. The other things, the other labels, happen to be as such. Now, in the legal discussions about these crimes, particularly genocide, there is a legal discussion to be had about whether the group perpetrating violence on another group and claiming they're not doing it because of their religion or ethnicity or whatever isn't always to be taken at face value, right? If you are a group of bad people who are looking to kill a race of other bad people, but you don't want people to think you're killing the second group simply because of their race, you could just lie about it, right? Of course. Then there needs to be a third-party investigation, which is what the UN attempts to do, to try and decipher whether the group one is being truthful about what they're doing and whether they can find evidence or not that they're lying. And that's the claim that many are making about Israel today, is they're saying things like, well, of course the IDF is not going to claim they're going into Gaza to kill Palestinians and Muslims. Why would they admit that? They know they would get in trouble for that, particularly. The U.S. would no longer send them weapons, for example. So they're not going to say that, but that's what they're doing. And we all just know that, right? And they back that up with what they claim to be evidence of the systematic killing of Gazans because of the actions of certain people within Israel. So, for example, they'll use a correlation argument by saying the IDF is in Gaza and everyone they're killing happens to be Muslim and Palestinians, and we know Israel wants to be its own country and not let Palestinians in, so there's a connection to genocide proof, and there's settlers in the West Bank who really don't want Palestinians to be living in the West Bank, Judea, Samaria at all, and so there's more proof, and then they'll post some story about some battalion commander or company commander that did something in Gaza that was against all of the regulations within the IDF and, killed a bunch of civilians. And they'll take those three separate arguments and they'll say, that's it. There's the proof. The proof is that Israel is committing genocide against another people. Done. The problem is, those are not causation elements. Those are coincidental elements, number one, because it's not the policy of the IDF to commit genocide against anyone. If the argument is that they're doing such, you need more evidence of that. And I'll give you a historical example. If you think that it's just arbitrary civilian killings, and because they're of the same people, the same group, and they're not going in and targeting the Hamas terrorists specifically, but they're bombing some civilian infrastructure, and then so therefore civilians die, and there's some proof. What about the historical example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? If the argument is the mass killing of people of one race, one group, in one land, who often are of the same religion, which is what was happening in Japan, and the United States just blankly just eviscerated civilians. How is that not genocide? It meets every single one of the other criteria. Every single one. You can even reduce or remove the nuclear conversation, and you can say when the United States and Britain eviscerated Dresden in Germany, it was like not a city anymore at the end of it. You just see the pictures online. It came with the Battle of Britain as well. You could flip it on the other side and say everyone who lived in England was British. They're English. They're white. They're not German. Well, they're both white, but you get my point. They're not German. They're British. And Hitler came in with the Luftwaffe, and he just killed as many people as he could, children, everybody else. It fits all of these with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial, religious group by killing members of the group, causing serious bodily. It's genocide. Absolute genocide. However, the argument is no. It may look like that, but let's bring common sense to the table and say Germany wasn't interested in killing every single English person. They were interested in winning a war. And it just so happened total war became a concept into the 20th century. And they killed women and children. The United States did it. Japan did it. We all did it. But none of us were committing genocide. And no historian of any value makes that claim. They didn't think that Truman wanted to kill every single Japanese person on the island. He didn't want to do that. He simply wanted to win the war. That's what the IDF is doing. But no one trusts the IDF, so they say it's genocide. That's the difference. And so we can get down to the nitty gritty, if you will. We can get down to the argument and just say, well, I just don't believe you. Well, then our conversation here is not worth it, because I could say the same thing about Truman, and you can say, well, I find no evidence of Truman that really wanted to kill all of the Japanese people, but I just believe it anyways. Because Truman did other things in his life, and there's settlers in the West Bank, and there's people that commit, war atrocities. And so I just don't believe you. I believe the Israeli people, or the IDF in particular, they want to kill all the Palestinians. I would argue, and do argue, there's more evidence against that. If it's against the Arab people, then that's nonsensical, because there are 2 million Arabs that live in Israel. So you may say, well, okay, so it's not the Arabs they're actually looking to kill, right? It's because how do you reconcile 2 million Arabs in Israel? So they're not looking to kill all the Arabs; they're just looking to kill all the Palestinians, whatever that encompasses. But if that were the case, Israel has the capacity to do that. If you make the claim that Israel is as militarily powerful as it is because of all of the weapons and material that they purchase from other countries, particularly the United States, and then a bunch of the stuff that they make on their own, then they could have just killed every single Gazan 20 years ago, 40 years ago. Every single one of them that they wanted. And then they could have went into the West Bank and killed every single one of them as well. But they didn't do that. They have the capacity to do it, but they're not doing it. Hitler had the capacity to do it and did it. It almost tried, right? He just stood up and said, I just don't like the Jewish people, and so I'm just going to kill as many people as I can because I don't like them. That's genocide. The genocide that occurs in Africa, where one country and one tribe goes in and tries to eviscerate another tribe, not just because they're at war, because they really just want all of them to die, and they do everything they can to kill every single one of them, then that's genocide. That's not what Israel is doing. When Israel went into Gaza, in particular, to eradicate Hamas from the Shifa hospital, which we'll talk about again in a future episode, when they went into Gaza, they brought neonatal care facilities, mobile neonatal care facilities with them, knowing full well there were babies, Palestinian children, who would not survive if they weren't given immediate care after they raided the hospital. That is in no way required by any standard in conflict. None. No military in the history of the world brought hospitals for the enemy, quote unquote the enemy, or even civilians, to the front line and gave them immediate care while they were conducting their operations. It hasn't happened in history, and it's not required by international law. However, Israel knows, Israel proper, the greater Israel, they know they're under such a microscope, and rightfully so. This is war. People die, and so they should be under a microscope at some level. But even more so, given their history, that they have to take a step further, and they got to do more. And so they do. That is not a description. That is not an example of genocide. Now, as we wrap this up, if your counter argument to that is, well, of course they did that because they're just trying to prove they aren't committing genocide, then we've reached the end of the discussion and there's no longer one to have. Because it's the same thing as to say, I don't have any real proof that Truman didn't want to eviscerate all the Japanese, but dropping a nuclear weapon on Hiroshima is just proof in and of itself, right? Like, that's genocide. It's just not, in my mind, it's not a conversation worth having. Okay. If we want to have a real discussion, and when I say real, I mean a valuable and worthwhile discussion about what may be happening in Gaza in particular, it's not going to help anyone by making the erroneous claim that Israel is committing genocide. Because from a countrywide, leadership-wide, military-wide standpoint, it's just not true. It's great rhetoric, and you can find some specific examples that if you use them in such a way and you write the story in such a way and you post a video in such a way that you can tug on the heartstrings of peace lovers and pacifists and say, look, here it is. But at the end of the day, it's not happening. And all it's going to do is end up creating a greater divide between the two elements that need to try and find peace. Because ultimately, that's really what we're looking for, right? We're ultimately just looking for peace. Put aside whether Gaza should be there or shouldn't be there, or Israel, blah, blah, blah. What we don't want is anyone killing anyone. We clearly don't want that. And so, but making these erroneous claims is just not, it's not helpful. And so here you'll see some of my, you're probably sensing a little bit of my bias there, but I guess at the end of the day, you can believe what you want to believe. I can't prove a negative. I can't have a conversation with you and prove to you it's not happening, right? I can't. What can I do? I can do the best that I can to point to some other aspects of this that at least show a connection to it not being the case. But anyway, so that's what that is. But anyways, that's my opinion. That's my argument as to why I just don't think it's genocidal. That doesn't mean Israel's doing a great job. That doesn't mean that they're perfect. It doesn't mean that, certain battalion commanders don't go off the ledge. It doesn't mean any of those things. It doesn't mean settlers don't exist. It doesn't mean those things. And it doesn't mean that there aren't people even in the Knesset that have the intention of pushing every Arab and every Palestinian out of the West Bank. Of course those people exist. Right? Neo-Nazis exist in the United States too. It doesn't mean it's the U.S. policy. Okay. All right. I've gone on. That's enough. Episode 42. Thanks for joining me today. Hopefully this gave you a few more things to think about in terms of this Israel-Palestine conflict. I've got more to go. Probably going to end up wrapping up the points that I at least have on my list here in the next episode. But again, we're kind of free flowing here. We'll see what happens. Maybe one more, maybe two more. Who knows? We'll see. But thanks for joining me again. Be sure to head to headlinesandhistory.com. You can shoot me an email, hit me up on social, YouTube, X, Blue Sky, whatever. Tell me I'm crazy and I'm wrong, whatever it is. But anyways, thanks again. Great to have you along, and we'll see you next time.